Well, it now looks like the Trevor Jacob's plane crash story has come to its inevitable conclusion, or at least the first one. As I'm sure you remember, this story generated a lot of noise when it first came out. But what's really interesting here is that it wasn't Jacob's decision to crash his poor plane on purpose that got him into the most trouble.
I'm just so happy to be alive.
Stay tuned. Back in May, we finally got confirmation that Trevor Jacob's plane crash was a deliberate act, not an accident, which I'm sure didn't come as a surprise to basically anyone in the world who's been following this story from afar.
The young man behind this stunt may not be smiling now. He is facing several years in prison.
In case you somehow managed to miss this whole story, Trevor Jacob is a YouTuber whose first claim to fame was that he represented the United States in the 2014 Winter Olympics as a snowboarder. He's also been active in various other extreme sports like motocross, skateboarding, parachuting, and a couple of other things. But most of the world learned about who this guy actually was back in December of 2021 when he published a video on his YouTube channel called "I Crashed My Airplane," which, as it turned out, was factually a 100% correct title.
Oh my gosh, dude. I have no idea where I am.
Trevor Jacob's YouTube channel didn't really have a big audience before this video was released, and in the past few months, Jacob has repeatedly removed and then republished it several times. At the time of this recording, the "I Crashed My Airplane" video is still up on the channel and has 4.3 million views. Now, I have already done a couple of videos looking into this charade, but to recap, Jacob took off from Lompoc City Airport in California on the 24th of November 2021. When he started this video, he explained that he wanted to fly to Mammoth Lakes, also in California, which is about 200 nautical miles away to the north-northeast. He explained that the reason for this trip was to spread the ashes of a friend, and after that he also presented a video sponsorship for a compact wallet. The aircraft that he was going to fly was a lovely 1940s Taylorcraft BL-65 with registration November 29508. Now, Johan Brown over on the Blancolirio channel explained that this aircraft was previously owned by a flight school in Lincoln, California, who used it for tailwheel training, which is where you practice the handling differences between aircraft with a nose wheel and a tail dragger like that one. At that flight school, this lovely old little airplane even had its own nickname, Patches. Now, what started off as a little bit suspicious was that Trevor Jacob had at the time, even before he released the video, not featured this plane in any of his previous videos or even mentioned that he had bought it. Instead, he used to fly an experimental Rons S-21 bush plane. During the investigation, it was found that he had actually bought the Taylorcraft shortly before the crash flight, announcing to people that he had big plans for it. Now, he did actually buy it as a flying aircraft, not as a non-airworthy part plane, as it was sometimes reported at the time, but we'll get back to that. Jacob boarded this plane while wearing a full sport parachute rig, which was suspicious in itself, and he then took off, taking a scenic route over the Los Padres National Forest, which is a large nature preserve near Santa Maria in California. And a little bit unusual, at least for a scenic flight, he climbed the small aircraft up to about 10,000 feet over the mountains. Then, approximately 35 minutes into the flight, he claimed that he experienced an engine failure and decided to jump out of the aircraft. His doomed little plane took a couple of wide turns by itself, which could be seen on the video, which Jacob had curiously had the frame of mind to film before it impacted the side of a mountain full of dry grass and bush. Jacob then parachuted into a landing somewhere nearby, hiked up to the crash site and recovered a multitude of cameras that he had just happened to have rigged all over the aircraft. And then he left it supposedly to look for help. Now, Jacob's version of what happened didn't really convince anyone who had even a passing interest in aviation or in parachuting for that matter.
I don't know why you just happen to have already had your door unlatched in the event of an engine failure. That's just a little fishy.
There was a ton of stuff to unpick about the video. Jacob's troubleshooting, for example, or his landing options, or the fact that it looked like he had fire extinguishers down his pants, and actually even the site of his parachute landing, none of which he even started to explain in the video. Now, me and a lot of my fellow YouTube friends analyzed all of these things at length in previous videos, but still, until May this year, we all had to be a little bit careful with commenting about Trevor Jacob's true actions and intentions, because you never really know. But then finally, he admitted to lying about all of it, just as we all knew that he did.
A daredevil YouTuber who deliberately crashed his plane last year has agreed to plead guilty to obstructing a federal investigation.
And it looked like by then that he had stopped caring about whether or not people actually believed this story or not, because he had finally realized that he had much bigger things to worry about. And I'll tell you all about that after this. I listen to and watch a lot of online content, and this story about Trevor Jacob actually reminds me of a podcast that I listen to called Scamfluencers. You should check that out. But as most of you who travels a lot already know, a lot of the best online content now starts to be geo-fenced off to different countries. And that's why I find myself very often using today's sponsor, NordVPN, especially when following sports, for example. Yes! Or in my case, local Swedish TV series and shows. NordVPN helps me to virtually move to wherever I want all over the world at the click of a button. And it also acts as a first layer of protection when using Wi-Fi in hotels, airports and restaurants. It's a super fast service with hundreds of servers all over the world and in loads of different countries. Now, if you clear your cookies before connecting to a new country using the app, you can also use Nord to enable much better deals on flights, hotels and rental cars, for example. You should check it out for yourself just by going to nordvpn.com/mentor now, which you can find here in the description. If you use that link when you sign up for a 2-year deal, you'll get an additional 4 months completely for free, which I think is a great deal. Thank you, Nord. Now back to the video. On the 11th of May this year, the United States Attorney's Office in the Central District of California published a press release. This document confirmed that Trevor Daniel Jacob did indeed stage this whole story. But the document also shed some light on what happened after the crash, which is actually the really interesting bit here. You see, there had been some rumors that somehow Jacob didn't know or think that he didn't have to report this crash to the authorities, since it was just a small airplane at a remote location and that nobody got hurt. And of course, that's not really how these things actually work. But in any case, Jacob did eventually inform the NTSB about the accident on the 26th of November, which was 2 days after the crash. And on that same day, the NTSB informed Jacob that they would indeed investigate the crash, which would involve examining the crash site and what was left of the aircraft. They also told him that he was responsible for preserving the wreckage so that the investigators could examine it properly. Jacob initially claimed that he didn't know where the crash site was, but he said that he would find it and then provide the coordinates to the NTSB. He had also told them that there was video footage of the crash, which he agreed to provide to them. So far, so good. Now, what's really curious is that this took place nearly a month before Jacob uploaded this fully edited video on his YouTube channel. It is not clear if he ever gave any of that footage from the GoPro cameras to the NTSB, but it is clear that he absolutely did not want the NTSB to examine the wreckage. And why do you think he didn't want that?
Oh my gosh, dude. I have no idea where I am.
Well, obviously the aircraft didn't have a mysterious engine failure as he had claimed it had, so he probably didn't want people examining the aircraft and its engine to find out that he simply switched it off or that he ran it out of fuel deliberately. But another little problem that many people noticed after he released the video was that his plane probably also had the wrong engine installed in it. The Tailorcraft BL65, which is what this plane was, normally came with a Lycoming O145B1 65 horsepower engine. This was the engine that this specific aircraft with registration November 29508 had installed in a picture that you could see which was taken in 2016. But a lot of people noticed that the engine in Jacob's video was instead a Continental, with the valve covers crudely spray painted red to make it look like the previous Lycoming engine. Now, changing an engine on a certified aircraft like this is possible. Other versions of the Tailorcraft B model actually do come with some other engines. But those kind of changes can be costly, involving checks and paperwork which cost a lot of money. Since we now know that Jacobs always intended to crash his aircraft, a changed and crudely disguised engine could maybe be a sign that this was a less expensive engine and that he didn't want to waste the original. Who knows? Well, at this point we don't really know when the engine was changed, how many hours the original engine had, or who actually made the engine change. But it appears obvious that Jacobs didn't want the NTSB to examine anything of this aircraft, neither the engine nor the fact that the plane normally had a little boarding step installed that he probably removed in order to make sure that it wouldn't interfere with his planned parachute jump. So, for all of these reasons, it seems like Jacob just decided to make the aircraft disappear. The press release of the attorney's office explains that on the 10th of December, almost 2 weeks before he released the video, Trevor Jacob went back to the crash site, but this time with a friend's helicopter. Jacob and his friend then lifted the wreckage using the helicopter and carried it to a place where Jacob had left a pickup truck with a flatbed trailer. Remember, all of this was taking place at the same time as the NTSB was trying to establish the crash location, which Trevor Jacob still claimed that he didn't know. Jacob then loaded the plane onto the trailer and drove it back to the airport where he had taken off from. Once he came there, he basically destroyed what was left of the aircraft, which was an airframe made out of steel tubing covered in fabric and wings that had a fabric-covered wood and metal structure. Jacob hacked the plane into small pieces, throwing it into several different trash bins at and around the airport. He admitted to doing all of this and his intentions behind it to the authorities as part of a plea agreement where he agreed to plead guilty to 1 count of destruction and concealment with the intent of obstruct a federal investigation, a crime that carries a statutory maximum sentence of 20 years in federal prison. Now, there are a few key things about the wording of this statement. For one thing, not only did Trevor Jacob deliberately crash an old airplane, he then lied and misled a number of federal agents who were looking for it. Jacob lied before and after he destroyed all of the traces of the aircraft, and all of that after it was clear that he had understood that he had to tell these agents where the plane was and that he was responsible for preserving it. And the ironic thing here is that it was this charge of lying to the authorities and obstructing an investigation that Jacobs was charged with, not actually crashing the airplane, which is worth keeping in mind. Also, a lot of people in the press concentrated on the 20-year maximum sentence that Jacob could get. But obviously, this would only be the legal maximum, assuming that there wasn't something else like a plea agreement in place, which there is. Back in May, most people who are following this story, including my team, missed the fact that the plea agreement itself was published at around the same time, or possibly shortly after the announcement of Jacob's guilty plea. And this plea agreement actually reveals the sentencing that Jacob's lawyers and the prosecutors of the Central District of California has already agreed on. Now, I'm not a lawyer, so feel free to browse this agreement yourselves for more details. But in general, the terms of the agreement are binding for Jacob's side if the sentence is no more than 24 months of jail time. And the same terms are binding for the prosecution as long as the sentence is no less than 18 months. This means that Trevor Jacob will spend between 1.5 years to 2 years in prison for this stunt, at least to start with. Now, there are also a lot of additional terms and restrictions in this document, like for example that Jacob can't apply for another pilot certificate during the term of the sentence and the probation after his sentence, but I'm not sure that that's actually a huge deal here. I suspect that the FAA will likely have their own objections to granting Trevor a pilot certificate again if he would even try to apply for one. Again, this obviously isn't a legal overview, but there are a few other things that we still don't know in the story and that could become important. For example, did Trevor Jacob have something to do with that engine change? And if so, did he have any help? And is there any paperwork about it? And also, what about this friend with the helicopter? Did he or she know that Jacob was trying to conceal evidence from federal authorities? If that's the case, is that person under a separate investigation? Also, and this is something that I'm quite interested in actually, what about the United States Forest Service? That's the authority responsible for preserving the Los Padres National Forest, and they would probably take quite strong issue with someone who crashes an aircraft into that park deliberately. To put it into perspective, access to the Los Padres National Forest is restricted for a large part of the year because of fire risks. And incidentally, the fire season and these restrictions end mid-November, just before Trevor Jacobs crashed his plane into there. A coincidence, I'm sure. Crucially, the press release from the United States Attorney's Office made specific mention of the fact that 2 assistant United States attorneys working on the Environmental and Community Safety Crime section were prosecuting the Trevor Jacob case. It's not clear if this federal agency may be bound by Jacob's plea agreement or if there's more to come from this. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. So to recap, we now know that Trevor Jacob lied about the purpose of his flights, that he lied about the failure of his aircraft and the reason for jumping off the plane. But what really got him in the end was that he also lied about knowing where the aircraft was, about preserving the wreckage, and that he moved and destroyed the evidence, keeping the NTSB and the FAA in the dark, until he basically revealed everything with his video anyway. So, was it all worth it? Well, if Jacob hoped that this video would give his channel a great boost and create a loyal following for his newer videos, he was wrong. Whatever revenue this video made wasn't followed by more videos. Jacob had released some videos looking at the aftermath of the crash and mocking those who called him out, but he has since deleted all of those follow-up videos. And speaking of video revenue, that plea agreement didn't just mention the 18 to 24 month prison sentence. It also mentioned a fine of $250,000, or twice the gross gain or gross loss resulting from the offense, whichever is greatest. And when it comes to further costs, the first thing Jacob lost was his pilot license, which was yanked in April already last year. Even before his plea agreement, the FAA didn't believe a word of his story, but couldn't, of course, sentence him since they're only an aviation authority and not a prosecution service.
This person does not ever belong in the skies.
So what they did was just make sure that he couldn't fly an aircraft. The cost of a private pilot certificate typically runs around $10,000 to $12,000, and on top of that cost, Jacob has already paid for whatever that poor Taylorcraft was worth. Plus, if Jacob paid to haul the wreckage away by the helicopter and it wasn't just a favor from a friend, well, that could probably also cost him another couple of $1,000s. Of course, all of this is before we consider the implications of a felony charge and his sentence, which would include that huge fine I just mentioned, lawyers' cost and all other things. So this was a terrible idea and a very expensive one. But what I just cannot understand is that Jacob, after having gone through all of this lying and removal of evidence and everything, still went ahead with releasing the video, which provided plenty of evidence to the authorities and the rest of the world about what he had actually done. That's like someone deciding to commit a murder, then hiding the murder weapon and the body, but then publishing a video showing the whole thing. I just cannot understand it. But frankly, like I mentioned in my first video about this, I am actually more worried about the impact that idiotic stunts like this will have on impressionable young minds. You see, over the years, many people have performed amazing, cool stunts with or without aircraft on YouTube, and to a casual viewer, a lot of those stunts might seem random or spur of the moment things. But in reality, especially if these stunts involve aircraft, there's a lot of planning that goes into making these stunts, and that often also includes talking to the authorities and get permits. I really hope that what Trevor Jacob did doesn't make life harder for other YouTubers out there who are doing great work generating fun aviation content, which is invaluable for inspiring the next generation of aviation enthusiasts, pilots, engineers, and so many others. As for Trevor Jacob, well, as I've always said, with great reach comes great responsibility. If you don't take care to be an example to follow, you could accidentally become an example to avoid instead. Have an absolutely fantastic day out there, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.